Good evening, and thank you for coming to Creative Conversations. This evening is really special. We'll be in discussion with Emee Morgan, our adjunct curator here at the Hilliard. She holds a BFA in Expanded Media from Alfred University and an MA in Arts Management from George Mason. And she's also currently a visual talented art teacher in Lafayette Parish. Most recently, I was curator of collections and exhibitions at the Master Museum of Art. My name's Ben Hickey. I'm sorry, I did that in the opposite order. And I think Emee will introduce our guest of honor.
So I think you probably all know Richard Landry. He was born in Cecilia, Louisiana in 1938, and his musical journey began at the age of 6, singing Gregorian chants in the St. Joseph Catholic Church. But it truly took off when at the age of 10, his older brother gave him a saxophone. After graduating in 1963 from the University of Southwest Louisiana with a degree in music education, he briefly studied the flute under Arthur Laura in New York and eventually made the move to the city in 1969. There he was introduced to Philip Glass by Keith Saunier, an artist from Louisiana, and Richard Landry played with Philip Glass Ensemble from 1969 to 1981. While he was in New York, he also made a connection with Leo Castelli, the prominent art dealer and gallerist, who launched Richard's career, giving him access to a portable tape deck and camera to record and document his musical performances. During that time, Landry created his seminal works, Divided Alto, 1, 2, 3, 4, and Quad Suite. As a musician, he's played with Little Band of Gold, Bob Dylan, David Byrne, Clifton Chenier, Paul Simon, Steve Reich, and many others. He's collaborated and worked with artists including Robert Rauschenberg, Laurie Anderson, Gordon Matta Clark, and many, many others, right? He's exhibited or performed at many venues around the world, including the Menil Collection, Castelli Gallery in New York, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and currently he resides in Lafayette, Louisiana, and owns and operates an 80-acre pecan farm in Cecilia. And without further ado, Richard Landry.
Well, I don't think I can add to that, except welcome to the Hilliard, and I want to thank Benjamin Hickey and Emee Morgan for putting this little show on, and also the exhibit of my 72 videos and this lecture, or talk, or conversation.
Yeah. So I think before we start, we want to show a little bit of Dickie's video here. Quad Suite, which was in this space for the last couple of months. We'll just show a little snippet of each section.
I'll give you a little history of these three pieces. The first piece was dedicated to Agnes Barton. When I was using the video, I noticed that the frets and the strings on the guitar reminded me of her paintings. And that's the reason why it was named after Agnes Martin. And there's a correction on, a friend of mine made, it wasn't a Stratocaster guitar, it was a Rickenbacker guitar. And it was John Lennon's guitar because my engineer at the time was working for John Lennon and he borrowed the guitar. The second piece was a small bamboo flute about maybe 6 inches long, which I made. And the name of it is Hickey's Grand Bois. There's a friend of mine, Russell Dupree, who was a teacher in the art department, had a dog by the name of Hebe, and they lived in a little community behind Brovage called Grand Bois. The third piece was saxophone, and the reason why you couldn't see the saxophone is that it was in a very dimly lit situation, which I didn't correct, and because I noticed the light on the bell of the saxophone was burning a trail in this very cheap camera. In other words, wherever that light went, there was a trail of light, so that's why I kept it. And they should have been heard, like, extremely loud. This is like a little soft, but that's okay.
The exhibition audio is about 3 or 4 times that volume. We just couldn't get these other speakers to go that loud.
All right. Dickie, do you want to tell us a little bit about how you got from Cecilia to New York? And once you were there, how did you become involved in the visual arts?
My brother is 8 years older than I am, and he had just come back from the South Korean War, North Korea. And he didn't serve, he was in the Air Force band. Anyway, all his friends were coming back to UL in the GI Bill of Rights. So I got to meet them, most of them jazz musicians, all are musicians. And one summer, my brother and his friend were going to graduate school at Columbia University in New York City. And my brother's friend, Rene Arsenault, suggested that we drive to New York City to see my brother and visit his friend. And I was just right out of high school, my freshman year at college. I'm going like, let's go. Well, his family had just struck oil and gas on their property, and he bought a 1956 Corvette, red and white. And in those days, there were no interstates, so we took all the back roads to New York City. And every town we came through in Kentucky and West Virginia, everything, we had to go through the town square. And one Saturday night, we driving to some little town in Kentucky and going through the town square, the courthouse in the center. Well, the women on one side of the street with their daughters, and the men with their sons on the other side of the street. And I was coming from Louisiana, I'm thinking, let's not stop here, let's continue to going on. So we drove straight to New York City, parked a few blocks from Birdland. I'm 17 or 18 at the time, my friend is 26 or 27. I'm completely zoot suit out, and he's normal. I walk in, and they card him. Anyway, I get to see Miles Davis, Bud Powell, and some of the great jazz musicians, and I was hooked about making my trip back to New York at some point. What else I did during that period, I have no recollection except going to nightclubs during the evenings and checking out jazz musicians. It wasn't until 1969 that I decided to finally move. There's a lot of story behind that, but I won't get into that. And the first went to 1968. I took the bus to New York and visited a friend, Keith Saunier from Mamou. And he suggested that I meet a composer by the name of Philip Glass. Because Keith said, I went to a concert of his some nights ago, and it was not only visually interesting, but also orally interesting. I said, what did Philip do? He had one sheet of music on the wall in a square, and a violinist going around playing the thing. So I called Philip, and I went to his apartment on 8th Street and 23rd Street, 8th Avenue and 23rd. And he had just come back from studying with Nadia Boulanger, the great classical woman composer in Paris. And I know what orchestral scores look like. And he was flipping through them, like, and I'm wondering why is he not showing me these scores. In hindsight, he didn't want me to show me scores because he was coming up. He had gone through this period, and he was finished with classical music, and he was thinking about his own music. Anyway, during the conversation, he said, "Excuse me, I have to make tea for a blind friend of mine." And he said, "You might know who he is," and he mentioned Moondog. And when he mentioned Moondog, I thought to myself, if this man has Moondog living with him, I have to pay attention to who this man Philip Glass is. Moondog is an American born in Minnesota, blind, and stood in the corner of 52nd Street and 6th Avenue, or 8th Avenue, or 7th Avenue, dressed in a total Norwegian outfit. He was a Viking with a staff and everything, and a cup, and he had a Braille typewriter which he composed and wrote poetry. When I was 7 years old, we got electricity on the farm in Cecilia. We got a radio, and my father and I used to listen to heavyweight fights every Saturday night live from Madison Square Garden. And after the fights, this gravelly voice would come on the radio, "Live from the streets of New York, jazz with Moondog." So Moondog was my first underground hero. So this is why I paid attention to Philip Glass, and that's the story. The second story, I first moved to New York, I only knew two people, Keith Saunier and an African American by the name of Bill Fisher, who was a band director in Opelousas. Well, with Keith Saunier, I didn't realize later that I had gone to the top of the art world with the Leo Costello Gallery, and with Bill Fisher. He was the chief arranger at Atlantic Records, and which is Aretha Franklin and all the great Joe Zawinul, Cannonball Adderley, all the great jazz musicians. So that's how I got to New York and why I went back to New York.
So can you talk a little bit about the general art scene in New York at the time? Because it seems like you got really involved with the visual arts, and that seems like that was a lot of your social world, right? What was the kind of going on at the time? What did it feel like?
Well, I first lived on Horatio Street on the east side, on the west side, which is now a block away from the new Whitney Museum. Then eventually moved to Chinatown, but through Keith and the Castelli Gallery, I started meeting the artists. Some well established and some not established at all. Mary Heilman, Susan Rauschenberg were one of the two first female artists I met, and we became great friends. We drank a lot, got drunk a lot together, and actually helped get Susan Rauschenberg her first show. Because one evening she said, "I'm leaving New York this weekend." I said, "Why?" She said, "I can't get a show." I said, "Well, let me make a call." So I called Jeffrey Liu, who had just opened 112 Green Street, an alternative art space where an artist could go in there and do whatever she or he wanted to do. In other words, tear up the floor, make holes in the wall, cut up the floor, whatever. So I told Jeffrey Liu that Susan was having a show. So he gave her a show, and in hindsight, I should have bought one of the paintings for $1,200 because 20 years later it sold for something like $2 million. It was, this was pre-Soho days. Soho, what we know as Soho today, was a very industrial place where there were these giant 6,000, 8,000 square foot lofts where machine shops, whatever, industrial. And it was against the law for people artists to live there. So artists boarded up their windows at night so the police wouldn't see them living there. It was a raw time. It was, New York was not what it is today. And then through Jeffrey Liu, I get to meet a number of artists. And one day I was walking down the street with Richard Serra and Philip Glass, and I was introduced to a performance artist by the name of Joan Jonas. And she invited me to her first performance. So I borrowed a camera from a friend of mine. He put the film in, said the ASA and the speed, and I went off and took the pictures. Well, a couple of days later, Joan calls me and says, "I saw you there with a camera the other night. Do you want to sell your photographs?" In the meantime, I'm plumbing with Philip. We were plumbers for 2 years. And I was thinking, plumbing, photography. So I started taking pictures and photographs of the artists I was meeting, and all struggling artists. None of them were anywhere near famous as they are today. So it was a very exciting time. And I had a loft in Chinatown. I had a 2-floor loft in Chinatown, which I was paying only $250 a month for both floors. And I was the Richard Landry. I cooked just about every night, and there were people from around the world. Artists were all coming and hanging out.
Wow. Do you remember the first time you saw video used as an art form?
Yes, I was good friends with Bill Wegman, the guy who had the dogs. He became famous for his dog portraits, the Winoramas?
Yeah. Winoramas.
Well, he lived above me and I was downstairs, and he invited me to look at some videotape that he had made. I'm going, like, videotape? He said, "Yeah, I got tired of using film." The reason why, so I went, and he had these like comedian kind of comedy videos, and they were quite long and quite interesting, and it was like very raw, black and white, and at first I thought he'll never get anywhere with this stuff. Little did I know, you know. So that's how the first idea that visuals that I had of, and then Keith got interested in video, and Leo Castelli bought the gallery, very cheap black and white Sony tape deck with a very cheap little box camera and a little editing box, which I got to use with Keith, and I did some, yes, that's how.
And you told me before about you'd seen some of the really early video shows in New York, right?
Pardon?
You'd seen some of the really early shows
Oh,
and
yes.
video exhibits,
Yes.
right?
Yeah, there was a place called The Kitchen where every weekend there was, videos by just about anybody who had become interested in video. The reason why we like the medium is that if you made a film, you had maybe 10 minutes of film. You send it to the lab. 2 or 3 days later, you get the film back. Maybe you have something, maybe you don't. With video, it was instant, and you could do it an hour tape, and we had a little editing. You could edit on the spot, which most of us did not. But that's the reason why we all fell in love with video, because it was such an easy, fast, visual input and output.
Yeah. As a musician, how did you find the relationship between sound and video? Because they have the combined tracks. You don't have to record separately, like film, right?
That's true. I mean, it's all live. What you saw there was live. And if you hear delays, I used in 1972, I came up with an idea of using 4 delays, quadraphonic. At that time, quadraphonic records came out, but it lasted about a year. I think there was a great rock and roll band that did quad concerts, but that didn't last very long. But the idea of the quad thing was I would set up a speaker in each corner of the room and play live into the microphone and delay the live sound 400 milliseconds, 800 milliseconds, 1200, 1800 milliseconds. So you get actually a quartet. So all of these sounds you heard were through that system. And I'm still doing it today, and people still want to hear it. It's I did a concert at the Guggenheim, and many musicians saying, "Are you going to use your system?" I said, "No. Guggenheim has a dome ceiling, and any space that has a dome ceiling, you have a natural reverb, which I wouldn't need a quad system. In other words, the sound comes back to you as you're performing."
How has your experience with performing with yourself changed over the years? Have you grown with yourself? I don't know how to ask the question exactly, but has your relationship with playing in quartet or using reverb changed?
Actually, really not. I mean, it's all improvisation. So sometimes it's a great concert, sometimes it's a mediocre concert, sometimes it's a horrible concert. Not really, but no, it hasn't changed. I don't think it has, unless somebody has seen multiple concerts and can tell me if I've changed.
Can you tell us a little bit more? I'm really curious about the final section of the video. You titled it "The Kitchen." Was it filmed at the kitchen?
Yes.
Yeah. And was that part of a performance at one night there, or was it done?
It was done.
Yeah.
It was closed. No, it was no audience.
Okay.
There was a woman by the name of Carlotta Schoolman who was interested in making videos, and she had some of the equipment, and she sort of helped me put it together. And we went one night when the kitchen was closed. The other two, the Hebe's Growball was done at another studio, and the guitar piece was done at 112 Green Street.
Can you talk a little bit more about who you were seeing at the kitchen, or like what was going on there? Were you there often?
Say that again.
Were you at the kitchen a lot?
Well, I lived only about 6 blocks from the kitchen, so there was performances just about every night. So I was there just about every night, and I knew all the people who ran the place. In fact, I did a concert at the St. John the Divine, Because one night at the kitchen, I asked the directors what was the biggest space in New York that I could perform at, and he said St. John the Divine, which I had no idea what St. John the Divine was. I didn't do my homework. Then there was this young man came up to me right before the concert and said, I'm Harold Hayes Perkins. I'm from Lafayette. I always wanted to meet you. How you doing? I kind of blew him off. Because with Philip's music, I have to have a half an hour of concentration. Anyway, concert finishes. The young man, Harold Perkins, comes to me and really glad to meet you. Thank you for being from Louisiana, etc. And as I was walking away, I said, what do you do in New York? So he says, I'm the caretaker at St. John the Divine. I said, can you get the key? He said, sure, come and visit. So I took the A train up to, 125th Street? I forget, way uptown. And when I came around the corner and saw what the St. John the Divine was, it blew my mind. So I knock on the door at the rectory, and sure enough, he's living upstairs with the bishop of the St. John. And he gets the key, it's about this long. We go to the big door, and it's like crunch and creak. And walk in, there's only one light in there, and I take out my saxophone, and I play one note, and it's about a 15 or 20 second delay. You know, it goes, before the note comes back, it's 10, 15, 20 seconds later. So that's my story about
Did you play a
the
concert
kitchen.
there?
Yes, I did. I did one with Robert Wilson called Grace to Grace, and I did a solo concert there. Unfortunately, it was not recorded. That's only.
You first got a video set up after attending a party, isn't that right?
After what?
After attending a party?
The camera.
A
right?
camera.
That was the film camera, right?
Yeah, that was
Yes.
the film
From
camera?
Rauschenberg.
Okay, that's a story, another story. Mike's wife, Tina Gerard, was working with Deborah here, a dancer. Well, Deborah wanted to see or to project a 16 millimeter film. She didn't have a projector. I had one. So she said, well, can I invite friends? I said, invite whoever you want. So evening comes, and the first person who rings the doorbell in my very tiny apartment on Horatio Street was Robert Rauschenberg. And before he walked in, I said, I want to tell you how I know who you are. Because I was graduating from high school in 1956, I was very interested in the art world, in art. Because at the time, the abstract expressionists were on the cover of Time magazine, Life magazine, de Kooning, Pollock, et cetera, et cetera. So one day I went to the library and I was leafing through Time magazine, and I came upon an image of a piece that Rauschenberg did. And when I saw that image, and I thought to myself, if that man can get away with this piece is hanging on a museum wall somewhere in the world, I'm free to do whatever I want to be or do. He had painted his bed and put it on the wall. So anyway, he says, oh, forget about it. Come on, what do you have to drink? I said, I have Jack Daniels, which was his favorite drink. So we show the film. We get really drunk. I put him in a cab at 5 o'clock in the morning with a Swedish German dealer. And a week later, Keith Sonnier was looking for a 16 millimeter camera. And Bob and I had a discussion about cameras and projectors and stuff. So I said, well, Rauschenberg has a camera. Why don't you call him? Oh, I can't call him. I said, you're all in the same gallery. Why, come on. Oh, I can't call him. So I got on the phone. Hey, Bob, what you doing? He says, I'm talking to you. Okay. Well, what are you doing? I'm talking to you. He said, no, what are you doing right now? I said, I'm hanging out with Keith Sonnier. He says, well, I'm having a party, come over. So I go to the party, and of course, we discuss the camera. And 5 o'clock in the morning, I can barely walk. I'm walking out with his camera, and Bob yells out, "Hey, wait a minute. I really don't know who you are. Oh, but you're from Lafayette. You're all right." So that's a story about getting a camera, a 60mm camera, which we did make a couple of films for Keith.
Was the experience of working with film and video essentially the same for you? Or were there marked differences?
Oh, totally different. I mean, with video, you instantly see it. With film, you have to wait a week or a few days before you see anything, and maybe you have something, maybe you don't. It's a whole technical experience. It's totally different.
And I take it that was a negative experience for you?
Yes.
Okay.
I don't think we ever
want
showed
that on the record.
I don't think we ever showed the film. The only thing left of it is an image, a still image of the film. I never did see it.
There's so many of early video artists who had a background in music or in performance, and I have this idea that part of it comes from them being familiar with performing, and that's how they structured their work, and they're already familiar with that process, because early video was, so much of it was performance. Did you find that to be the case, where it was very much, it was in real time, you weren't stopping and editing?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people were using it as documenting their work, and they could see it immediately and correct their performances or correct whoever was performing or whatever. And with the music thing, I mean, I started doing a lot more, but it got to the point where I saw that you needed a lot of money to start making really good videos, not these, like low budget, one-time videos. I went to a studio one time and I did a 5-minute video and it cost me $800. I'm going like, dude, it's I was a poor boy, struggling artist. I couldn't afford that.
Yeah.
And so one thing, improvisation and performance is really important to you as a performer, to you as a video artist, and real-time processing. That was important to many artists, kind of being in the moment. And we actually altered this quad suite for this iteration, for this exhibition, because there was something you didn't like about it. And so it's kind of breaking from the kind of canonical tradition of early video work, use it with a 2019 kind of interpretation of editing and processing. So what led you to wanting to alter the work?
We're talking about the last piece, the saxophone piece. It's hard for me to listen to. So I'm thinking of the audience. That's why I shortened it. It was I think it was 15 to 20 minutes long, and it was excruciating to me, and I didn't want to put the audience through it. That's as simple as it gets.
I liked it.
Me too.
I know some people liked it. I mean, okay. If you want to see the extended version, I'll show it to you. But, it's also, many people think I'm a jazz musician. I love jazz music. I try to play it, but I'm not a very organized. Jazz is very organized. It's by the book, by the beat, by the measure, by the note. And I tried it, and I worked really hard on it, but soon realized that it's not for me. So free improvisation is what I do. Even in my concerts, people ask me, when do you come up with the melodies? Is every concert the same? Not every concert is the same. I go back to melodies that I'm used to, but I'm always searching for the limits of the saxophone. It was only invented in 1856, so it's not that very old. And John Coltrane changed the sound of it. Ornette Coleman changed the sound of it. Ben Webster changed the sound. Everybody has a different approach to it, and my approach to it is that I'm always trying to see how far I can take it, sonically, especially in the upper register. The saxophone is built where if I'll explain it very simply. This saxophonist from Rochester, New York, came and gave a lecture here at UL back in in 55, and he brought a saxophone with no keys. I'm going, what is this? The saxophone has perfect harmonic structure. In other words, you play that note with no keys. You play that one note and go like almost 5 octaves above the low note. Most instruments you cannot do that. So with that experience with that man, led me to still try to like find the limits, or not the limits, but how far I can take the saxophone.
So I understand how improvisation, performance, there's a through line in your video work and even in your photography because you're documenting something that's kind of happening in that moment. As it relates to your painting, how do you embrace improvisation with your painting, or do you use painting to express other urges?
I get asked that question a lot. What relationship my music, my photographs have to the paintings? To me, all three of them are separate. When I'm thinking about a painting, I'm not thinking about music, and I'm not thinking about photographs. I'm thinking about color and dimensions, and what goes into a painting. It has nothing to do with my music. Maybe people can see or hear something in the paintings, but that's not what they're three separate things, I think.
Well, and I'm really interested in how you and I were talking about, you were doing some work removing fences, and you were making multiples out of barbed wires, this kind of performative, multiple creative process that you were doing, and you were fiddling around with that. Have you continued to think about that or work on that, or can you describe it?
We're talking about, I have a farm in Cecilia, and it was a dairy farm at one point, and there were fences all over the place to separate the cattle from this field, from that field, let the grass grow and then put them. Anyway, after my father died, I decided to take all the fences down. This took about 5 years with barbed wire and hog wire. About 15 years ago, when I moved back to Louisiana, I let this old black man I let him use 5 acres or 4 acres of property, and he fenced it in. Well, recently he turned 91 and gave it all up, so I decided to take all the fences down. So if any of you have ever had an experience with barbed wire, it's not fun at all. It's a very treacherous piece of wire. Anyway, I'm trying to wrap them up in one continuous roll, and it springs back, and I only have one good eye, so I'm thinking, wait a minute, this is like too dangerous. I've got great gloves. So I started cutting from post to post, like a 4-foot section, and I'm going like, and I bush hog a lot. Bush hogging is cutting with a 5-foot mower behind my tractor, and a lot of times we didn't pick up all the barbed wire, and it gets caught up in the blades, and it's a whole 9 yards of getting it apart. So I decided to start bending these wires in, and each one started getting different shapes. I'm going like, wait a minute, or just do multiples. So I came up, wow, duh, I'll make multiples of barbed wire. So yeah, and we're thinking about a piece for the museum here. The idea, at first I was thinking, wow, bring the barbed wire into the museum and make a piece in the museum. No, not a good idea. Not a good idea. So I was talking to Susan David the other night, and she said, well, why don't you make the piece at the farm? Duh, sure. So I haven't started yet because right now I'm chainsawing and splitting wood because we had a number of trees that came down during that little hurricane in September. Anyway, the barbed wire is coming.
I'm really excited about it because it's a totally different urge. It's just like how your paintings and other things are totally separate.
Right.
It's just another expression that you're doing to explore and think about. And so it's really, I'm very enthusiastic about it.
I don't want to put it in the dump, and I don't want to, just put it to some use, make art again.
It's not the first time that you've been involved in making art with unusual things, right? You helped with splitting, right? With Gordon Matta Clark.
Gordon Matta Clark. We became very great friends, and one day he said, let's go to the Bronx. I said, what are we going to do in the Bronx? He said, I'm going to cut up a building. I said, what are you talking about? We went up to the 5th floor of an abandoned building, and he sawed out with a sawzall a section of the floor, which is, there's linoleum, and then there's the piece was about this thick, and it was 4 foot by 4 foot. We did a number of cuttings that day. I don't remember how many we did. And if you don't know his work, this man had studied architecture and decided to start cutting up buildings. If you don't know his work, it's very interesting. He actually split a house in half and cut it right down the center. And the way he opened it up, it was on brick pilings, and he chipped away some of the bricks so that the house would actually open up. And another, in hindsight, he wanted to give me that first slab of wooden flooring he cut out, and I said, I don't have room for that. Well, that sold for like $3.5 million a few years back. So if anybody wants to give me any art, I will take it.
Didn't you have a Richard Serra piece for a little while?
I had Richard Serra. Richard Serra and I met him through Philip Glass, and because Philip was plumbing, plumbers use a lot of lead. So Philip suggested that Richard use lead of some sort. So at Richard's first show at the Castelli Warehouse uptown, we did splashing, a piece called Splashing, where he melted the lead, and with a ladle would splash it against a rectangular piece, and then let that cool off and peel it off. And that became the splashing. And then he started using 4 foot square lead plates, ½ thick, each plate weighing 400 pounds. And the idea is that he came up with these many different pieces where they held themselves up with the weight. One was the house of cards. If you ever tried to make the house of cards with playing cards, you can see how difficult it is. But we're dealing with 400-pound plates. The workers on that was Spalding Gray, an actor, myself, Philip Glass, and Chuck Close. I'll never forget, we'd pick up the plates and hold them in position, and they got, like house of cards. And Richard would go like, okay, at the count of 3, let go if we can get to the count of 3. So it's 1, 2, whoa. 1, 2, 3, and you back up. Otherwise you'd be squashed. And every afternoon after doing this very dangerous work. Richard would tell us, y'all come up with an idea for me tomorrow. Chuck Close came up with a piece called the clothespin, which is a sheet of very thin lead, 4 foot by 4 foot, held up by a rolled piece of lead against the wall, the clothespin. And I came up with 2 plus 2 plus 1. In other words, 2 plates, and a 1 plate, leaning into with a rolled lead in the center, holding everything up.
Is that it right there? Behind him?
That in the corner, yes.
Yeah.
And that's the splashing of the lead right there. And the night before the opening, all the pieces fell. And that afternoon, Leo was downstairs, and he said he ran out of the building like the building was coming down. Yes. Yes. If you're not familiar with Richard Serra's monumental sculpture these days, look him up. It's incredible work.
But you had one of his pieces for a little while.
I had a
right?
piece. It was a piece of lead plate, 6 feet long by 2 feet, and it leaned up against a timber 5 by 5 inches by 5 feet. And it was first shown at the Leo Castelli Gallery on 77th Street, but it wouldn't stay up. The lead was always slipping out, and they tried everything, and I looked in the corner. There was a ashtray with sand, so I went and grabbed a handful of sand and threw it under the lead plate. It never fell after that. Oh. That's a story nobody knows. That's the first time I ever tell it.
That's cool. You told me a story when I was a young artist that about going to the Guggenheim with Richard Serra after working in the studio one day. Can you tell us about that?
Oh, we are splashing lead like you see us. We got lead splatter, so we're really dirty. And, hadn't shaved for a couple of days and really dirty clothes and shoes and everything else. And there was an opening we wanted to go at the Museum of Modern Art. So we get to the museum, we walk in, and of course, where's your ticket? And Richard just bursts out and keeps walking, we're artists. So that's, and Richard and I, we like to drink a lot, so he was a bull in a china cabinet. Whenever we get to a bar, he'd almost normally start a fight talking about art. So we were barred from many bars in Lower Manhattan for years.
There's one other story that I wanted to have you tell because it's something that I think about a lot and it gave me a lot of confidence when I was just beginning to learn about art. About going to a museum with Rauschenberg one day.
We were at the, I don't know if anybody familiar with the Rocky Tour. Rauschenberg, back in the 80s, mid-80s I think it was, decided to take his art around the world. So he rented a 747 and put some of his collection of his work into the plane. And first we went to Santiago, Chile, then Cuba, then Mexico City, China, Japan, Russia, and it ended up at the National Gallery in New York City. And I was honored to open these shows for him. Anyway, we were walking around the National Gallery, and there was a man lecturing on a painting of Bob's, the big black and white painting which I think would fill up half of this wall or maybe longer, which Bob created in a 12-hour marathon session. And there was I think the curator, assistant curator, somebody talking about the painting, explaining this and explaining that, and blah, 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 how this was done and how that was done. And Bob is standing there, and he's kind of has this shitty grin on his face. And when the curator stopped, he said, "Bob, was most of the stories I said correct?" He said, "Not one of them."
That one. Is there anything else that you want to tell us about tonight? Maybe either about your work or your music or anything else that we haven't touched on?
About 3.5 weeks ago, I did a concert at the Sidebar, a very tiny, tiny bar in New Orleans, which I didn't know how small it was, but it was really small. And this writer from New York introduced me to the booking agent there, and so he said, I'd heard that this 82-year-old man who I used to play with 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, and also a free improvisator, I thought he had died, but he was back again playing, and he was playing at this club. So I said, look, I'd like to have name is Kid Jordan. And he said, do you want a piano player, bass player, or drum? I said, no, I want another saxophone player. So I got this young woman, Aurora Nealon. So, of course, Kid Jordan, I was told, always showed up late. So Aurora and I started the concert. We did a 25-minute set, and we stopped, and she says, I need to take a break. I said, well, go ahead. And I said, well, anybody has a question? Well, that was another half hour, 30-minute. Like, I learned how to kill time playing music by talking and answering questions. And we did another 20-minute set. We told most stories. I told most stories. And then Kid Jordan comes in. We did a 30-minute set. And I asked him about his career. And everybody told me that he had never, ever talked about how he started and you know, his history and stuff. And then I finally gave it to Aurora. And so it's not on killing time, but it's, you know, answering people's questions. I know people love to hear stories, and I love to tell stories. We could be here 2 more hours if you want. So if you have if anybody has any questions, now's the time. Or more.
I'm curious how you arrived using delay as a compositional tool, and how you ended up using the specific delay times that you use, because it seems like you kind of use that as a fixed part of your improvisation.
You mean a fixed part of improvisation?
I'm wondering how you arrived at using delay as a compositional tool.
Oh.
And how you ended up using the specific times that you
I got you. I was working with Lawrence Weiner, the conceptual artist, and working on a film. He said, I want some music for a film. I said, I already have it. He said, what do you mean? I said, well, it's already done. So I walked around with him at a boombox, and every time he needed music for the film, I'd punch. Well, I did a stereo delay for one of the pieces, and I found it interesting, and you know, it was okay. I didn't like what I played, but it was I didn't. So one of my best friends through college and came to New York and was with the Philip Glass Ensemble. His wife went nuts, and he came to Louisiana to take care of her, and started working in the oil field and had an accident and eventually died. So I went back to New York, and Philip Glass the ensemble was doing a concert one evening, and I decided I wanted to do a memorial concert for my friend Robert Prado. And I didn't know what I was going to do, so I turned to my engineer. I said, you know that delay I did? I said, can we have 4 delays? He said, well, in those days, it took a Revox tape recorder to do this. We didn't have the digital stuff. He said, well, it all depends how many tape recorders we have. We can have 8, 4, 6. I said, well, let's do a quad, 4 delays. So he plugged it in at rehearsal. I blew a few notes into it and did the concerts, and realized after the concert, I never wanted to have a group. I never wanted to have a band. that I would remain. I was so turned on by this thing that we came up with. That's how, and I also use it. I have a piece with 15 saxophones, also a piece with 12 saxophones, which is I go in the studio and record the first 4, and then rewind or overdub 4 more, and overdub 4 more, or 3 more, or whatever. So yeah, it is a tool. Does that answer your question? Yes?
Okay. Yeah, Hickey, this might be a shot in the dark, but the year that you met Keith Saunier in 1968, 1969, that was the time of this really important international exhibition, When Attitudes Become Form, which was in Bern, Switzerland, and then traveled to London. And I know that Saunier did about 4 or 5 pieces in that show, and Sarah as well. He had the main atrium at When Attitudes Become Form, which was curated by Harold Zeman. So I'm just curious if you have any memories of people talking about that exhibition in New York. It was March, April 1969. If Saunier ever mentioned that exhibition. Ava Hess was in it as well. But these Americans went to Europe for this traveling show.
When Attitudes Become Form, right?
Yeah.
Well, I was new to the art world, and all the people involved in that show were new to the art world. And I was in the Whitney when we were installing everything else, and I was going around looking at some of the works. I'm going like Robert Ryman's white paintings, and I'm going like, what is this? You know, like a white painting? Of course, Rauschenberg had done it earlier. And it was all brand new to me, and at the time I wasn't foreseeing the future or thinking about the past. I was just trying to earn money to stay alive in the city. But somehow, I don't know if I'm answering your question because I can barely hear what you asked, but I assume I answered the question.
Yeah, I'm especially curious about Keith Saunier's pieces that he contributed to When Attitudes Become Form. I think there are 4 or 5 of them, and there's basically nothing written about them in art history. So I was curious if Keith Saunier had mentioned that experience to you in discussion.
Were the pieces glass or neon? Do you remember?
I've only seen a few black and white photographs. And
okay.
They were large abstractions done on the spot. I haven't encountered much written about them.
Oh.
Yeah.
I don't remember this.
Yeah.
That's
and Lawrence Wiener, he did the cutout from the wall.
Right.
The rectangle out of the wall.
Right.
Okay. I'm just curious if anyone had mentioned that exhibition.
No, this is a very famous show. I mean, it was, it hit Europe big time. Rolf Ricker was, the German dealer was partly, I think is the one who named the show, When Attitudes Become Form. Famous German dealer, Rolf Ricker.
Would you know how Keith got from Mahmoud to New York and Leo Castelli?
How Keith got?
Yeah.
Keith graduated from UL in whenever, and went to Rutgers and got his master's degree. And I'm not sure how Leo saw the work, but he and Richard, I mean, there was a little, they became friends. And a couple of, Alan Surratt was part of that, and I think he's the one who introduced Keith to Leo. Also, John Gellisma was invited to join the Leo Castelli Gallery, but John decided to come back home. That's a true fact.
I didn't know that one.
Anyway, I think Leo had gone to to the graduate show that Keith was in at Rutgers, and that's how. It's a good question. I have to ask Keith, but I assume is what I remember.
And Jake, to close things out?
Sure. Can you talk about the creative climate you have today, like right now coming back home to Louisiana, versus maybe the creative climate in New York, being around so many influences? Do you find similarities or welcome differences? Does that make sense?
Right now, everybody's an artist, a guitar player, or a songwriter. I see so much bad art, horrible art, that I'm very, you know, it hurts compared to what even in New York City, I'm seeing some of the exhibitions, I'm going like, what? I grew up in the great period of the 70s, and I don't know, it's right now I love looking at art. And I remember one time the Time of Acadiana wanted me to be a critic in Lafayette. I'm going like, you don't want to read or hear what I'm going to say about the art. You know, that's my attitude at the moment. But I'm glad to see everybody making art. I mean, come on, it's a great thing. I mean, it releases a lot of emotions, a lot of tension, and put it up on the wall. Play your guitar and sing your songs. It's an open world. It's a free world, as of now, unless Trump gets reelected again.
Well, thank you for coming to the final creative conversation of the season. This one, like all the others, has provided a new window into understanding human experiences, elaborating on our exhibitions, and I want to invite you back next semester for the next season, for which I'm also really excited. So thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Also, I'm a very open book, and I'm very social, so if anybody wants to come and visit or talk more about art or music, I'm an open book. Okay, thank you for coming.